All right, good afternoon, everybody. Event Trader here. We're coming up to just about the last 30 minutes of trade at the moment. I'm going to be moving through my week ahead comment. I posted some of the early thoughts here, some of the key things to keep an eye out on, and I'm going to discuss that in a second. Quick look around the markets here. Relatively quiet afternoon. After some early gyrations, we had that initial attempt at a rally following some of the into the jobs report, and then a bit of a rollover following at the beginning of the opening of trade. We saw the S&P pop up to that 2885 area before getting hit. Certainly some of those headlines that we saw on tariffs. We've been kind of discussing the threat that they posed, and that will continue over the weekend. I'll go through some of the trade things that we should be keeping an eye out on for. I was talking with Carmine Ateo, and he had mentioned that so far the running playbook for the administration would suggest that perhaps a decision on a date could come from next week on when they look to press forward with that 200 billion in tariffs. Then of course we'll see if China responds, and if they do, which I fully expect them to, then the Trump administration will go on another 267 billion, or basically just put in a tariff on everything that China sends to us. So, this continues to digress, and the relationship certainly doesn't appear to be getting any better at the moment. So we're going to have to see how this plays out. But I think we got a perfect example of the headline risk that lies in front of us. And at the same time, too, it's also interesting to see the bounce, but for me, the bounce is a pretty weak one, and I wouldn't be surprised to see us close down around that 2867 level. I just don't see anybody coming in to buy here in the final 30 minutes, especially with headline risk over the weekend on trade at potential item. It still remains short that last piece. I plan on carrying it over the weekend. If I get stopped out, it's at break even. I'm not concerned about that, and I have some headline risk on my side, as well as short-term trend here too. So that's basically what we're looking at going into this final 30 minutes of trade. Now let's take a look at what's lies ahead for us. We'll go through the key themes first, kind of touch upon that. I think one of the key items to note is that Thursday, which just a real busy day on the macro front. We're going to be starting off with the Bank of England and European central banks both meeting on we're going to be paying close attention. Bank of England, obviously, is Brexit on the horizon, as is the ECB for that matter. There was a lot of talk, of course, earlier in the year that the ECB was moving closer towards tightening, but some dovish comments from Draghi over the last couple of meetings has pushed back expectations for that to mid-2019 for a possible rate hike at the earliest. They are set to end their asset purchase program at the end of the year, of course, and I wouldn't expect any change there, but we'll definitely get a little bit of a better idea of the central bank outlook for 2019 as we press a little bit closer from both those central banks, the Bank of England and the ECB, and of course the Draghi speech. In the U.S., we'll be getting some data hitting right around when Draghi's talking, most notably, of course, the CPI numbers. We saw the hot average hourly earnings this morning, so want to see if that's a trend that continues across the board. And we will also get industrial production numbers a little bit later during the Draghi press conference. So and then later on that day too, just to keep the action coming, a 30-year bond auction. So a lot of macro there, and in Europe and the US, and then also in China that evening, we'll be getting the latest GDP, industrial production, and retail sales numbers. So Thursday, if you're looking to take a sick day, don't do it Thursday. That's going to be a busy one. And just to throw a little cherry on top there, we also got Oracle and Adobe earnings from the tech side, and that's not even getting into, which I will in a second here, the Barclays Financial Services Conference. On Wednesday, Apple's going to be in focus. They're going to be announcing what's expected to be their new iPhones. I'm really curious to see what the market reaction to this is going to be. Not so much as a read on Apple as much as a read on sympathy in tech, which has certainly been weakening here. And I'd be really curious to see what happens when we get a new product announcement, that just to see if buyers continue in or if they sit there and continue to move towards the sidelines. Apple, of course, has hit the $1 trillion mark. It's been joined by Amazon, although I'm not sure if Amazon's still there after the last few days. Apple still is sitting in that. I believe 208 is the magic number for the 1 trillion mark. So we'll see if that pulls back at all. But real curious to see what tech does in reaction to Apple. Then taking a look at the Barclays Financial Services Conference next. That's going to be Wednesday. It's actually Wednesday through Friday. I apologize for that. But we've got, I mentioned the Raymond James comments from earlier, and I think that that's some of the comments were pretty notable, talking about the weaker NIM out there and some of the slower earnings growth or loan growth that we'd been seeing. With this Barclays Financial Services Conference, this is one of the bigger conferences of the year. A lot of it has to do with its timing, as it comes right ahead of the October earnings season, of course, Q3 earnings. And this is a who's who. Everybody's there. Deutsche Bank, Citi, SunTrust, PNC, Bank of America, BlackRock, Comerica, USB, the mortgage insurers, RDN and MTG, JP Morgan's there, Wells Fargo, everybody's there. And this is really going to lay out the financial health of the markets and really provide to us some insight on how the financials are performing ahead of Q3 earnings. And notable because we're already going to get the Apple news on Wednesday, tech making up about 25% of the S&P. Next biggest is the financials, which is about 14%. And then I'm remiss for not mentioning this, but I would probably also note that Morgan Stanley and Bank of America both have healthcare conferences starting Monday and Tuesday, and that makes up, that's the third largest component of the S&P. So we got about 53% of the S&P kind of laid out in focus for us next week, not too far away from earnings. So that's going to be pretty important to keep an eye out on. We already discussed some of the macro backdrop, particularly with Thursday, but these company reports are going to be of great interest for the markets here as we start getting ready and seeing people starting to get positioned for that Q3 earnings season. So that's going to be the main themes for me next week. And certainly trade will be in the backdrop. As I mentioned, there's a very good chance that we could see an announcement because Carmine was noting the last two times that they've done a review of these and gotten that response period back, they waited about a week and then they pressed forward with the dates. This is for both the steel and aluminum tariffs they've done this for, as well as the tariffs on the 50 billion of goods that they laid out. So that certainly suggests next week we're likely to get the decision, and I am fully expecting the administration to move ahead with it. As we can see, they're already planning on moving ahead with the next 267 billion of numbers. Going to be running out of real estate to keep tariffs on, but certainly looks like it's going to be something of interest for next week. week. Taking a look at the four sectors that I like to break us down into on the U.S. macro, noting a couple of Fed speakers, Bostic on Monday. He speaks a couple of times. And he's the busiest man in the Fed as far as I'm concerned. Guy speaks every other day, I think. So, he's definitely keeping an open communication for the markets. So hats off to the hardest working man in the Fed there, Raphael Bostic. Later on we'll be getting the July consumer credit numbers as well. Tuesday, slow day, just wholesale inventories. Wednesday, we will be getting the PPI numbers and a WASD report too, which will be of interest. I'm sure Commodity Trader will be taking a look at that. 10-year bond auction as well. Want to keep an eye out on that yield, which certainly saw a big spike today following the jobs numbers that rallied up to 294. It's still below the 3% level, but gaining steam towards the higher end, especially when you consider that we got a Fed rate hike that sits off, we'll call it 3 weeks at this point. And speaking of that 3-week period, 2 weeks ahead, we always get the Fed Beige Book, and Wednesday, of course, we will get that Fed Beige Book. We'll also be joined, St. Louis Fed Bullard will be speaking. He's been hitting a dovish note, and I'd expect that to continue on Wednesday. Thursday, we already kind of laid out some of the key items there. Also a 30-year bond on that, and Mr. Bostic speaking again that day. And then Friday, we've got another busy day on the macro front with the August export-import prices, August retail sales numbers, August industrial production and capacity use also out that day. Preliminary look at Michigan sentiment, always a good consumer survey. So plenty on the U.S. macro front at the end of the week. Earnings, slow week for earnings. I would note Monday we got Hovanian, so a little bit of color on the home builders, and we got Sono, which I took that long, and of course I do believe that trend is also long this one, so that'll be an interesting one to keep an eye out on. Wednesday we got Pivotal, another cloud software name, and then Thursday we're going to be getting Kroger. And in the afternoon, 2 tech names of interest, Adobe and Oracle. The international macro up next. We'll take a quick look. Starting tonight, China's trade balance is out. So, obviously won't probably see much of a market reaction to it, but could see a Twitter reaction to it and a push towards a decision potentially. But, it's just something to keep an eye out on. Sunday, nothing big out. We're getting a revision to Japan's Q2 GDP number. We'll also get China inflation data out on that evening. Monday morning, we should be getting, this is still to be determined at this point, but China money supply and new yuan loans, as well as some Japan economic sentiment. Busy day for the UK with Q2 GDP, manufacturing and industrial production out, trade balance and construction output. And then later on that evening, we should be getting a Japan 30-year bond auction. Moving to Tuesday, I would say that we got the UK jobs report, so busy week next week for the UK, but the big numbers will be the German and Eurozone zoo surveys, getting a good idea of the business environment out there. Moving on to Wednesday, we'll be getting some industrial production numbers from the Eurozone, India, and Italy. Germany will also be having a 30-year bond auction, which is always a good proxy for trying to judge risk off trading. And Japan will be busy again with some machine orders, PPI numbers, their quarterly Tonkin economic survey, and Australia will also be lighting the lamp with some inflation expectations and the jobs report. Thursday, we get some CPI revision data from France and Germany, but again, the Bank of England and the ECB, as well as the Draghi presser, will be the key. And then we got that Chinese economic data later on that evening. And then finally, Friday, some Japanese industrial production figures, as well as the Eurozone trade balance, the Bank of England's Carney will be speaking, so you'll get to clear up any comments there. The Bank of Canada will also have their review. So again, central banks remain front and center. And then looking at the corporate conferences, we got a Credit Suisse Steel and Mining conference going on. Obviously, steel's been a hot sector, so we'll want to keep an eye out on the impacts of the tariffs on these companies. A UBS Leisure and Transport conference, and then the Morgan Stanley Global Healthcare Conference will all kick off Monday. On Tuesday, the Bank of America Global Healthcare Conference will be kicking off. And then moving on to Wednesday, we got that Apple event, and that's the Barclays Financial Services starting up, as well as Goldman Sachs Communicopia Conference, and Credit Suisse has a basic materials and an industrial conference that day. And then finally, Thursday, Gabelli will be kicking off an aerospace and defense conference, which obviously we've heard Scott talk about the push that we're seeing in some of those names, and they will remain on the board for us to keep an eye out on. So, as you can see, no shortage of tradable events next week. We're going to continue to keep an eye out on anything that develops on the trade front, of course, but these are the items of interest that we're going to be watching. And please, if there's any questions on anything, feel free to write in, and we'll